The chamber erupts as Jasmine Crockett slams Ivanka Trump for turning the Bible into a stage prop. This isn't politics. It's a war over faith, morality, and the very soul of America. Millions hold their breath. In the end, can raw truth shatter the performance built on lies? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing chamber blazed under merciless lights. Cameras locked on every angle, broadcasting live to a nation holding its breath. The air was thick, tense. Every cough and shuffle drowned beneath the hum of anticipation. Millions of eyes were fixed on this room, waiting for the explosion that everyone knew was coming. Ivanka Trump strode in with icy confidence, her white suit glowing under the glare, her smirk sharp as a blade. She moved like royalty, every click of her heels echoing through the marble floor. When she sat, it wasn't as a witness, but as if she owned the stage. Her expression told the room, "I cannot be beaten." Directly opposite sat Jasmine Crockett, calm yet coiled like a drawn bow. No jewels, no theatrics, only a thick dossier before her stack like ammunition. Her eyes locked on Ivanka, cold and unblinking. One smile was arrogance, the other, silence, was warning. The chamber waited. Who would speak for America's faith, Ivanka's spectacle, or Jasmine's truth? The tension had already been building, each second stretched tighter than the last. And when Ivanka leaned forward to speak, it was like a match brushing against dry kindling. She didn't hesitate, her voice sharp and clear, carrying across the chamber with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. "I walked with my father to bring the Bible to the heart of America." It was a sacred moment. Her words didn't simply echo. They cut through the silence, pulling heads to turn cameras to zoom and every microphone to lean closer. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though she had seized control of the room. Some lawmakers gave small nods as if swayed by her polished certainty. Reporters shifted pens, scratching furiously, whispering to each other about the power of her delivery. The atmosphere tilted toward her like the whole chamber was leaning into her self-assurance. Even those who despised her pause caught in the magnetism of her posture and tone. Confidence radiated from her like heat, and for a moment it looked as if she had turned the narrative to her side. But Jasmine Crockett remained silent, her face shadowed by the weight of restraint. She didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't even blink more than necessary. Her eyes darkened, a steady storm brewing beneath the calm. She tapped a slow rhythm with her fingertips on the thick cover of her dossier. Each beat louder than it should have been, like a countdown that only she knew. The rhythm built into something sharp, something final. Then, without warning, she shifted and delivered 3 deliberate knocks on the desk, loud enough to slice through every murmur. The signal was unmistakable. The technicians obeyed instantly, and the massive screen behind the committee flickered to life. White light spilled across the room, searing the chamber like a flash grenade. All heads turned to the image blazing across the screen. It wasn't words now. It was sight-proof memory captured in cruel clarity. And there it was on the screen. Ivanka appeared in her pristine white dress, the Bible clutched firmly in her arms, walking side by side with Donald Trump in front of St. John's Church. The scene was frozen in a moment the nation remembered too well. Behind them, smoke drifted like ghostly scars across the sky, the residue of tear gas that had been unleashed to scatter peaceful protesters just minutes before. The power of the picture was undeniable because it wasn't staged in secret. It was broadcast to the world. Gasps tore through the chamber. A few lawmakers inhaled sharply. One hand pressed against the table as if steadying themselves against a quake. Reporters surged forward. Cameras clicked in rapid fire, each flash punctuating the silence like gunshots. The weight of that single image slammed into the room with the force of a hammer blow. No one could look away. No one could deny the truth as standing naked on the screen. For a moment, history itself seemed to replay in front of their eyes. But Ivanka did not crumble. Instead, she tilted her chin upward, her smirk curling wider, her eyes cold, but glittering with defiance. The arrogance in her expression was almost theatrical, like a villain refusing to bow to the truth. Her laughter was silent but visible carved into her face. Finally, she let her voice ring out, dismissive and sharp as glass. "A single photo makes you tremble." That was a moment of history. I am proud to have been there. Her tone dripped with disdain as if daring anyone in the room to challenge her. The audience shuddered at her brazenness. Some whispered, some shook their heads, but no one missed the challenge in her voice. She wasn't retreating. She was daring Jasmine to strike harder. It was the arrogance of someone convinced that power could always rewrite the past. It was the smile of someone who thought even truth could be bent into spectacle. For Ivanka, this wasn't a photo of shame. It was a badge she wore proudly, even if the badge was soaked in smoke and fear. Jasmine didn't smile, didn't flinch, and didn't rise to Ivanka's attempt at dominance. She stood with slow certainty, her figure sharp against the glow of the screen, her voice calm, but slicing the kind of calm that made every word land like a blade. She pointed at the image behind her and spoke directly, her tone cutting through the arrogance in the air. History does not honor tear gas. History remembers those who turned the Bible into a prop. Her words echoed like steel striking steel, final and undeniable. The chamber was stunned again, the silence suffocating after her words. Reporters lowered their pens for a moment, the sound of clicking cameras falling still. Every eye swung between Ivanka's smug defiance and Jasmine's icy blade of truth. It wasn't just two women clashing. It was two visions of America colliding, one of spectacle, the other of sacrifice. And the air itself seemed to know that only one would survive the weight of history. The echoes of Jasmine's last words still hung in the air when the chairman struck his gavel sharply. The bang cut through the noise like thunder, forcing the chamber into a tense quiet. Reporters lowered their voices. Lawmakers shifted in their chairs, and the audience leaned forward. The tension didn't vanish. It only sank deeper, pressing down like a weight on everyone's chest. The silence was not peace. It was the calm edge of a storm. Ivanka lifted her chin higher, her posture rigid, her eyes cold and unflinching. Her voice carried across the room, sharp as steel. My family has always stood with the church. We do not need anyone to question our faith. The declaration was delivered like a dagger thrown across the table, meant to cut Jasmine down. A few lawmakers nodded in agreement, while others tightened their jaws, recognizing the arrogance dripping from every word. Ivanka's smirk lingered as if she believed her lineage could silence doubt. Jasmine did not strike back immediately. She let the silence hold. Let Ivanka's words linger in the stale air like smoke. Then she leaned into her microphone, her voice steady but heavy with memory. When I was a little girl, Jasmine said slowly, my mother would take me by the hand every Sunday to a small church in Dallas. She paused, her eyes not leaving Ivanka's face. That church didn't shine with chandeliers or marble floors. It was crowded with tired faces, men and women who worked all week and still came to pray. They prayed for justice. They prayed to survive. Her voice deep and growing heavier with each word. I remember my mother's hand trembling when she prayed. She asked God to keep our community safe from violence, to keep our children alive long enough to grow up. That was faith. It was not a performance for cameras. It was not a stage. The chamber was still, every syllable clashing against the glossy image Ivanka had painted moments before. Jasmine's words were not loud, but they carried like thunder rolling beneath the floor. The contrast cut through the air with brutal clarity. On the screen still glowed the image of Ivanka in her white dress. The Bible clutched like an accessory, smoke curling in the background. Across the table, Jasmine's story carved a second image. A young girl gripping her mother's hand, listening to whispered prayers in a small church filled with grief and hope. One was spectacle polished for power. The other was raw, born from blood and survival. The room felt the clash, not as an idea, but as two realities colliding. The cameras zoomed in on the lawmakers. Faces shifted, some hardened, others softened. One senator bit his lip, eyes glassy with unspoken memories of his own youth. Another leaned back, pressing fingers to his mouth, visibly shaken. Even the reporters trained to record without reaction slowed their pens. They were not just documenting politics anymore. They were witnessing a fight over the soul of faith itself. The battle was no longer abstract. It was visible in every breath, every stare, every heartbeat in the room. Ivanka's smirk faltered for the first time just slightly as Jasmine's words painted her faith as shallow theatrical. She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing, trying to reclaim control, but the contrast was too sharp, too undeniable. One woman spoke of pews filled with tears and trembling prayers. The other boasted of marble altars and stage photo ops. The divide grew louder than any gavel, louder than any speech. It was written in the silence of the chamber. Jasmine let the quiet linger again, then spoke one final line, her voice like the strike of a match. Faith that survives hardship, she said. Eyes locked on Ivanka cannot be outshone by faith that lives only in spectacle. The words dropped like lead landing with a weight that made even the cameras seem to hesitate before clicking. The room quivered with tension. Lawmakers visibly caught between the two worlds laid bare before them. The duel of voices had revealed more than arguments. It had exposed the difference between faith lived and faith staged. The silence that followed was not empty. It pulsed with the sense that something greater was still hidden, waiting to be unleashed. And as the tension coiled tighter, the thought spread through every corner of the room. Unspoken, but undeniable, Jasmine had not yet shown her ace. When it came, Ivanka's pride and defiance would not be enough to save her. The chamber was still vibrating from Jasmine's last story when Ivanka suddenly leaned forward, her body tense like a predator, ready to strike, her voice slicing through the silence. "I do not need anyone to teach me about morality," she shouted, her pitch rising sharp enough to rattle the microphones. "I stood beside the president, and that is an honor you will never have." The words cracked across the room like a whip. Reporters jerked their heads up, pens scratching faster. Lawmakers stiffened, some nodding out of loyalty, others frowning at the sheer arrogance pouring from her mouth. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She rose to her feet, her chair scraping back the sound loud and raw in the charged air. Her voice thundered across the chamber so strong it seemed to vibrate in the walls. "You stood there but on the tear gas of your own people." The declaration hit like a strike of lightning. Gasps broke out, cameras flashed, and the audience rippled with energy. For the first time, Ivanka's eyes flickered with a flash of fury, her smirk replaced with clenched teeth. Jasmine didn't let the momentum slip. She lifted a single sheet of paper high above her head. The chamber hushed at once, waiting, sensing the weight of what she carried. A statement, she said firmly, from Bishop Marianne Booty, leader of the Episcopal Church. She lowered her gaze to the paper and read each word with deliberate clarity, letting the silence between lines echo. "I do not want the Bible or St. John's Church to be used as a prop for a political performance." The words rolled heavy through the chamber, undeniable, holy in their authority. The reaction was instant. A shockwave rippled through the crowd. Reporters cried out, "Oh God!" as cameras snapped like gunfire. Lawmakers shifted uneasily, some shaking their heads, others whispering harshly under their breath. The statement was not political spin, not an opponent's accusation. It was the church itself condemning the act. The glow of the screen still showed Ivanka holding the Bible like an accessory, now framed by the bishop's condemnation. Spectacle and shame fused in a single image. Ivanka's rage exploded. She slammed her palm down on the desk, the crack echoing like a gunshot. Her eyes burned, her voice erupting with fire. "Do you dare question the faith of millions of Americans?" she roared, leaning forward, her hair whipping over her shoulder. "I had the right to stand there because I am the daughter of the president." Her tone was venom and fury, half threat, half desperate defense. Some lawmakers flinched at her anger, but others simply stared, recognizing the tremor of fear beneath the roar. Jasmine didn't blink. She stood tall, her eyes locked on Ivanka's blazing stare, unshaken by the storm. Her voice cut through low, but sharper than steel. "These are not my words," she said, raising the statement again. "These are the words of the church. Will you deny your own church as well?" Her challenge hung in the air, heavier than the smoke in the photo behind them. The silence that followed was deafening. It was no longer just Jasmine versus Ivanka. It was Ivanka against the faith she claimed to defend. The entire chamber trembled on the edge of revelation. Ivanka's anger blazed. Jasmine's defiance stood unbroken, and the crowd waited for the next hammer to fall. The clash was not finished. It was only the beginning. And that moment led directly to the warning no one in the room could ignore. Jasmine still held a government document, a weapon strong enough to shut every door of escape. Ivanka inhaled sharply, her chest rising as though she were summoning strength from the glare of the lights. Then, in an abrupt shift, her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. The sight was shocking, not because it showed weakness, but because even in tears, she radiated defiance. Her chin remained high, her eyes flashing with pride, as if she wanted the world to see her pain as proof of her power. The contradiction was jarring grief painted over arrogance like theater on the grandest stage. Her voice cracked, rising into a cry that echoed against the chamber walls. "You are hunting my family!" she screamed. the words vibrating through the microphones. "All of this is only because I carry the Trump name." The declaration rang out like a siren, a desperate attempt to flip the narrative. She was not just defending herself, she was casting herself as the victim of an endless vendetta. The room felt her fury, but it did not move with her. Several lawmakers exchanged uneasy glances, some leaning toward one another in whispers, their faces caught between discomfort and disbelief. A senator folded his arms, his jaw tightening. Another shook her head slowly, lips pressed in disapproval. The performance was too polished, too rehearsed, like a script written for pity rather than truth. The chamber was not buying the act, and the silence and response cut sharper than any shouted rebuttal. Jasmine did not rise, did not lean into her microphone. She simply sat motionless, her eyes fixed on Ivanka with a gaze colder than ice. That silence was more powerful than words, more devastating than rebuttal. She let Ivanka's cries echo unanswered, refusing to grant them the dignity of a counterattack. Her restraint made the contrast starker, one woman unraveling in spectacle, the other holding steady a stone. The weight of Jasmine's stillness pressed harder than any speech could. The camera zoomed in mercilessly, catching every trembling tear, every twist of Ivanka's face. At home, millions of viewers saw the exaggeration for what it was. The tears, the trembling voice, the righteous pose. It was all too much, too staged, like a performance designed to sway sympathy. Viewers could see through it, and in that exposure, Ivanka's play for pity collapsed into melodrama. The audience was no longer convinced. They were unsettled, even repelled. The chamber tightened into silence once again, not from respect, but from rejection. The echoes of Ivanka's cry lingered like smoke after a fire fading, but sour. The tension hung thick, and everyone knew the storm had not yet broken. Jasmine had not yet moved, had not yet spoken. But the sense of inevitability was crushing, and that inevitability was clear. Jasmine was holding something far heavier than silence. She was holding the knockout blow, a secret report from the Department of the Interior that would lock every door of escape for Ivanka. From the charged quiet that followed the outburst, the room felt like a live wire waiting for the next spark. Jasmine pushed back her chair and stood steady and unhurried, the scrape of wood on marble cutting through the hush. She reached into her stack of files and pulled out a thick-bound volume, the cover stamped in Black Inspector General Report, 2021, Department of the Interior. She held it up with both hands so the title faced the cameras, then set it on the table with a solid, echoing thud. Her fingers spread the pages with the care of someone handling evidence, not theater. 1,000 eyes locked on the document as if it were a loaded device about to go off. She leaned into the microphone, voice firm, clean and loud enough to carry to the back row. The dispersal of protesters at Lafayette Square was not intended to protect security. She read each word pronounced like a verdict, but coincided with the president's plan for a photo opportunity in his entourage. The single sentence hit the chamber like a drop hammer. There was no flourish, no narration, just the plain line from the report delivered without mercy. Jasmine paused, letting the statement stand by itself, letting the silence around it prove its weight. You could feel the floor settle under the truth. Jasmine slid a finger down the page, then looked up and locked eyes with Ivanka. In that entourage was the name Ivanka Trump. She did not shout it. She marked it like an officer reading a name into the record. The camera swung to Ivanka, catching every twitch of jaw and flare of nostril. The words did not accuse in the abstract. They placed her inside the scene, inside the decision, inside the moment the tear gas hung in the air. The line closed the distance between the image on the screen and the woman at the table. Sounds surged at once, a human wave of shock and recognition. Whispers became a hiss that rolled across the tiers. A congressman covered his face with his hand elbow planted on the desk, as if bracing for impact. Another turned away from the camera's lips pressed hard, eyes narrowed in disbelief. Reporters fired questions. No one answered, shutters chattering like teeth. The energy in the room flipped, and it was clear the center of gravity had moved to the open book on Jasmine's table. Ivanka's mouth opened, but no words came at first, only breath stalling in her throat. She seemed to search the ceiling lights for a lifeline, then found the microphone with shaking focus. I don't remember. The sentence fell out in pieces, thin and breakable. It was not a denial. It was a retreat, heads tilted, pens slowed. The phrase lay bare on the table like a cracked shield that would not hold another hit. Jasmine did not move for a full heartbeat, letting the admission hang there, fragile and exposed. Then she stepped closer to the mic, her face calm, her tone, even the blade of her voice sheathed but sharp. "You don't remember? But it was your own hands that handed the Bible to your father." She turned her head slightly to the cameras as if addressing the nation seated in living rooms and kitchens. "America saw the final line fell last heavy and permanent, and history will record it." The chamber did not breathe. The record did. The shock of the report still hung in the air like a ringing bell when the moment tipped into a final confrontation. Ivanka jerked upright shoulders, squared breath sawing in her throat as fury overtook poise. Her voice tore through the microphones high and raw, the sound of pride scraping against panic. "You will regret humiliating me and my father." She screamed, every syllable pitched to wound. The words cracked against marble and wood, bounced off glass and steel, and dared the room to deny her. For a heartbeat, it felt like she was trying to bulldoze truth with volume alone to force the chamber back under her heel. The camera swung hard to Jasmine, framing her in a cold halo of light. She did not flinch, did not blink, did not reach for more paper. Instead, she let a small, razor-thin smile cut across her face. The smile said she had seen this rage before and had already measured it. When she spoke, her voice was low but sure, the kind of steady tone that makes crowds lean in without thinking. "No. America will only regret letting you turn the Bible into a prop." The line landed with a surgical precision that made noise unnecessary, slicing the heat out of the moment and leaving only fact. The chairman reacted before the murmurs could rise, lifting his gavel and bringing it down with a clean, authoritative crack. The report, the photo, the statement, everything that mattered was now weight on the scales. And he set it there in plain view. "The evidence will be entered into the official record." He said, each word measured and final, the language of law closing around the scene like a seal. Closing around the scene like a seal. Pen started again, not frantic this time, but methodical, as if scribes had returned to work after a storm. The echo of the gavel spread like ripples, quieting the last tremors of spectacle and restoring the stern geometry of the room. Ivanka's body seemed to lose tension all at once, as if the air had slipped out of a balloon. She dropped into her chair with a dull thud, the posture of command collapsing into a slump no camera could beautify. Strands of hair slipped forward, dulling the sharp lines she had tried to keep, and her hands hung uselessly at the edge of the table. Her eyes stared past the microphones at nothing at all. No plan, no script, no stage left to own. The harsh lights that once made her gleam now made her look pale, almost grainy, as if the lens itself had stopped believing her. Around her, the room did not gloat. It simply recorded. Jasmine let the silence breathe for a long second, then closed her eyes the way a runner might at the tape spent clear unshaken. The breath she drew in was deep and steady, and the breath she let out carried the weight of a battle fought with documents, patience, and steel nerves. No gesture, no grand bow, no gloating glance, only the discipline of someone who trusts the record more than applause. She placed her hand flat on the file, not to claim it, but to anchor the moment where it belonged. When her eyes opened again, they were calm and certain the fight finished exactly where it should be, on the page, in the light, and in the record. When the gavel's echo finally faded, the story detonated beyond the chamber walls. Satellite trucks fired up, producers barked orders, and studio lights flared like sirens cutting through a storm. Editors carved clips into sharp, repeatable blows, building a reel that felt like a chase scene. Headlines stacked across screens while push alerts vibrated on kitchen counters. The city seemed to lean toward the signal, waiting for the first official line to set the tone. Then the chyron hit like a hammer. Across networks, the banner stamped itself in bold, unmissable type. Biblegate, Ivanka defeated in Congress. Anchors read it clean, voices steady but tight, the cadence of confirmed impact. News tickers crawled with timestamps, quotes, and the exact names locked into the record. Phones lit up in living rooms and bars as the headline jumped from one app to the next. Talk radio seized its callers, boiling over as producers cut to commercial and back again. The country didn't just see the verdict. It felt the weight of it land. Clips rolled on, looped the photo, the smoke, the statement, the report, the final exchange. Analysts broke the sequence into beats, circling key frames like coaches diagramming a decisive play. "Here is the handoff of the Bible," one said, freeze-framing with a stab of a stylus. "Here is the tear gas still hanging," another added, widening the image until the haze filled the screen. The replay didn't dull the blow. It wound the spring tighter. By nightfall, the montage moved with the rhythm of a pursuit, relentless and exact. Sunday came early in spirit, and pulpit answered before dawn. Emails even finished syncing. Sanctuaries filled some, hushed, some humming, with low, uneasy voices. Pastors stepped up, hands on wood worn by years of palms and prayers. They didn't need to invent language. They only needed to repeat what conscience already knew. And so the line rang out from city cathedrals to country chapels. Faith cannot be a political tool. The words landed like a bell, unmistakable and grounding. In a brick church off a quiet avenue, the choir's opening note stalled as the pastor lifted his hand. He looked out at faces he had married, baptized, and buried beside, and the room steadied under his gaze. "Faith cannot be a political tool," he said again, slower, as if placing stones across a river. He spoke of the danger of turning prayer into promotion and scripture into staging. He reminded them that the holy cannot be rehearsed, only lived. Heads bowed not in defeat, but in recognition. Across town, families gathered around screens, paused on that frozen frame. A child pointed and tugged a sleeve, voice small but precise. Why did they use the Bible for a photo? Forks hovered, words stuck, and the room waited for an answer that would not hide. A mother spoke first, careful and plain, because photos can win applause, but faith asked for sacrifice. A father added, "A picture can be staged in a minute. Real faith is proven over years." The child looked back at the smoke on the screen and nodded, understanding more than the adults wished. Minivans carried those questions to school drop-offs and grocery runs where conversations kept surfacing like buoys. A grandmother told her grandson about nights she spent ladling soup after storms. No cameras, no speeches. A nurse on break scrolled past the headline, then put down her phone to help a shivering patient with an extra blanket. A deacon texted a neighbor, "Need a ride to your appointment," and showed up 15 minutes later without a selfie. Each small act pressed back against the image with quiet, stubborn force. The difference between posing and serving began to glow like a flare in fog. Opads poured in, some bristling, some elegy, all circling the same hard center. Commentators argued about precedent law and optics, but the letters to the editor cut straighter. "My father carried a Bible to the picket line to keep courage." One wrote, "He never held it for a lens." Another said, "I learned scripture from a woman who cleaned offices at night and never posted once." The moral wasn't abstract anymore. It had feet, hands, and names. The page, for once, felt heavier than the screen. By evening, the headline had become a shorthand, and the shorthand had become a caution. Parents tucked children in and answered the question one more time. Why did they use the Bible for a photo? The reply stayed the same because the truth stayed simple. Because some people think power lives in pictures, they said, smoothing a blanket edge. But power, the kind that lasts, lives in love, shown when no one is watching. The child fell asleep to a quieter kind of proof. And so the message settled over the country with the calm that comes after lightning. True faith is not in a picture, but in the act of protecting people. It was spoken in sanctuaries and kitchens, written in bulletins and on sticky notes by the door. It was practiced in hospital wards, food pantries, school offices, and apartment hallways. It moved without hashtags because it did not need applause to breathe. It walked past the camera and into the hard work of care. And as the night finally cooled, the headline kept flashing while the lesson took root. By week's end, the headline had hardened into lesson plans. And the lesson plans were already shaping a different kind of reckoning. Classrooms that once treated faith and politics as parallel rails now brought them to a single seminar table. In lecture halls and seminar rooms, professors wrote one word on the board Bible gate and circled it twice. They told students, this is not gossip. This is governance, ritual, and power colliding in public. The room tightened as if the case itself had just walked in and taken a seat. Theological faculties moved fast, drafting modules with the speed normally reserved for crises of doctrine. Syllabi sprouted a new unit, faith, spectacle, and statecraft. The Lafayette Square case required materials listed the Inspector General report, the bishop's statement, and the televised exchange line by line. Assignments asked students to annotate the footage like scripture marking where liturgy ended and theater began. Final papers carried prompts that felt like courtroom charges. Define misuse of sacred objects in modern politics with evidence. Seminaries added practicums that felt uncomfortably real. One class staged a mock committee hearing with half the students defending a photo-op theology and the other half prosecuting it under pastoral ethics. A professor paused the exercise and said, "Listen to yourselves. Are you preaching or are you producing?" Silence followed, the kind that exposes nerves. When they resumed, voices were steadier, and arguments finally named what they had been circling: motive. Course packets grew thick with case studies, reaching backward and forward in time. Students read about kings staging public sacrifices and leaders choreographing prayers for cameras. They paired those texts with testimonies from small churches that knew the cost of authentic service. Margins filled with questions. Where is consent? Who benefits? What is the harm? A visiting scholar closed her talk with a line that stuck. The sacred is not a set piece. Outside academia, the country's long memory woke up and went to the mailbox. Men and women over 50 who had watched presidents fall and lieutenants resign began writing letters to the editor in careful carved lines. "I lived through Watergate," one wrote, "and this feels like the moment the tape clicks on." Another said, "I watched Iran-Contra teach us how power hides in paperwork. Now I'm watching power hide behind a Bible." The ink looked heavier than usual, as if the text carried weights at the end of every sentence. Editors noticed and gave the letters a page of their own. The letters did more than vent. They arranged history like tools on a bench. "Watergate taught us that recordings do not lie," a veteran wrote, "and Biblegate taught us that cameras do not bless." A retired teacher added, "Iran-Contra showed the choreography of deniability. This shows the choreography of piety." The language was plain, but the comparisons were surgical. You could trace a line from one scandal to the next and feel how the country had been learning even when it didn't mean to. Newsrooms gave the correspondents a banner, letters from the long memory. The series ran daily, mixing sharp recollection with unblinking advice. "Do not let this be an episode. Let it be a standard," one letter urged. "Do not let spectacle dictate the sermon," another warned. Comment sections, usually a chaos of heat, turned almost reverent for a week. Then came the town halls, the library forums, the church basement panels where the carpet smelled like coffee and dust. Posters read sanctuary and state. Where is the line? Folding chairs filled then, overflowed, and organizers opened windows to cool the temperature that the conversation kept raising. A moderator would ask, "Where does symbolism serve the public? And where does it deceive?" Hands flew up, and the room became a courtroom with no judge, only jurors with lived experience. People weren't looking for a fight, they were looking for terms. A night in Milwaukee felt like a bellwether. On stage sat a constitutional lawyer, a pastor, and a community organizer, each with a stack of notes and a glass of water that no one remembered to drink. The lawyer said, "The First Amendment protects religion from the state and the state from religion, but not from opportunism." The pastor said, "When scripture is lifted for applause, it is not being read." The organizer said, "If your prayer needs a camera to count, it isn't a prayer, it's a pitch." Applause came in short bursts, the kind that agrees without relaxing. Debate didn't avoid the hard edge, it sharpened it. Someone asked, "If a leader prays in public, is that always suspect?" A woman in the back stood and answered, "No, but if the prayer clears a crowd first, that's not prayer. That's a parade." Laughter broke the tension without dulling the point. The panel closed with a draft pledge written on a poster board. "We will not stage the sacred. We will not monetize the holy. We will not confuse ritual with brand." People lined up to sign. Meanwhile, the image of Jasmine, head high, voice steady, document in hand, traveled from screens to murals, from headlines to school assemblies. Someone painted her on a brick wall downtown with a simple caption, "The woman who dared to defend true faith." A church youth group printed it on a banner for a service day and carried it past the soup kitchen they stocked each month. The phrase moved fast because it fit easily in a mouth and sat firmly in a heart. It did not ask for hero worship. It asked for imitation. Jasmine did not chase the icon. She tried to redirect it. At a community center, she spoke to volunteers under buzzing lights and said, "If you remember one thing, remember the rule we proved. Faith belongs to people, not productions." She told them to keep their receipts for diapers and groceries to file for grants to train the next set of hands. Symbols matter, she conceded, because people remember symbols, but service matters more because people survive on service. The applause was warm, not loud, and afterward people signed up for shifts. Universities borrowed that tone and wrote it into policy. A divinity school issued a public witness protocol that required any official use of religious symbols to include consent contacts and accountability. Another school launched a practicum placing seminarians in shelters and clinics before they ever touched a pulpit. A flagship course changed his final. Instead of a sermon, students had to design a week of care with measurable outcomes. Grades came with footnotes and phone calls to verify the work had been done. Journalism programs adjusted their style books, too. New entries advised reporters to separate coverage of religious claims from coverage of religious acts. Do not equate posture with practice. One rule read, photo editors were urged to pair images of politicians holding scripture with images of actual religious service like food lines and hospital chapels. Context is not commentary. An instructor said it is clarity. Young reporters learned the difference and loved it. Civic groups adopted a small but potent ritual. The Not a Stage pledge, 3 lines recited before events that risk veering into performance. We gather for people, not cameras. The leader would say, we hold symbols to serve, not to sell. The crowd would answer, we measure success by care, not clicks they finish together. It took 20 seconds and changed the temperature of the room. In living rooms, the over 50 crowd stayed loud and specific. They formed reading circles that paired old committee transcripts with the new report trading highlighters and memories. This is where they tried the same trick. One would say tapping a paragraph. This is where it broke. Another would reply tapping a different one. They wrote more letters, sent more emails, called into more shows. The country discovered that insight is a renewable resource when it is respected. An interfaith council convened a national summit that filled a civic arena with rabbis, imams, priests, pastors, monks, and lay leaders in worn denim and Chris suits. The opening invocation lasted 10 seconds. Let truth be enough. Panels built a framework that could be carried home. Define sacred objects. Document consent. Disclose. Document consent. Disclose. Intent. Reject staging, and tie every public act to a private practice. The closing statement was short. Build altars in kitchens. People laughed, then wrote it down. Slowly, a shared standard took hold that crossed party lines without pretending differences didn't exist. You could feel it in how town councils handled invocations, how agencies wrote memo headers, how campaigns briefed their advance teams. It wasn't a law. It was a line drawn in the mind and underlined in the heart. The maxim traveled on coffee mugs and meeting agendas, printed small and spoken plainly. Morality is not a stage. By the end of that season, the case had been absorbed not as scandal alone, but as instruction. Theological programs had rewired courses. Citizens with long memories had anchored the narrative, and public forums had hammered out usable guardrails. Jasmine's face still showed up on murals, but the more important image was the one you could not photograph neighbors doing the work quietly when no one was watching. The lesson had outlasted the clip because it was heavier than a moment and lighter than a slogan, and that lesson did not need a spotlight to hold. It lived in a rule taped to refrigerators, pinned in staff rooms, tucked into wallet windows. It lived in the way people spoke and the way they paused before reaching for a prop. It lived in the steady refusal to dress up devotion for applause. It lived most of all in the ordinary bravery of keeping faith with one another. Morality is not a stage. When the echo of morality is not a stage settled, the record began to harden. Archivists logged every second of the hearing, every frame of the photo, every line from the report into federal repositories. Style books noted the new term as if entering a fault line on a map Bible gate. Civics' instructors marked the date beside other constitutional stresses and underlined the role of evidence over spectacle. Within months, new editions of history surveys carried a sidebar that asked students to trace how symbols can be used and misused by power. Documentary crews moved next building timelines like engineers laying track in a storm. Opening shots cut from the smoke over Lafayette Square to the gavel strike and back again, framing a cause and consequence loop the audience could feel in their chest. Producers let silence do as much work as narration, holding on the photo long enough for viewers to squirm before the bishop's sentence landed. Editors layered captions that did not editorialize location, timestamp, source exact words. The effect was cold and clinical, which made the heat of the truth burn brighter. One film structured itself like a chain of custody demonstration, each link verified aloud. The Inspector General report appeared as a living document, passages highlighted while a neutral voice read them flat. Split screens paired the text with the broadcast frame, so the paper and the picture argued together, not apart. No reenactments, no swelling strings, no staged inserts. Only the original materials sharpened until they cut. Viewers didn't feel led. They felt confronted. Another documentary chose the human witnesses and let them carry the weight. A medic from the square described rinsing tear gas from a protester's eyes and looked away before the camera could follow the tear on his cheek. A church custodian spoke softly about unlocking side doors for neighbors who needed water and a place to breathe. A reporter replayed the moment the crowd was pushed back and said, "The lens saw everything, but the lens did not bless it." The stories were plain, and because they were plain, they struck like hammers. Critics, not usually kind to political films, agreed on the craft and the clarity. They wrote that the best documentaries did not attempt to crush viewers with outrage, but pinned them to the table with facts. Freeze frames became signatures. The Bible balanced like a prop, the smoke drifting like a stain. The mic catching the exact pitch of a single word, proud. Awards discussions used a new phrase, civic editing, to describe cuts that illuminate rather than inflame. The audience ratings were less about stars and more about steadiness. Did the film hold the line? In seminars, from communication schools to ethics institutes, scholars converged on a shared diagnosis. Biblegate, they argued, was not just a scandal. It was an image collapse, a point where a brand's core symbol flips against itself. The white suit, the Bible, the church facade, three pillars designed to project virtue combined to produce the opposite impression. Textbooks sketch the mechanism, symbolism, overload, motive, misalignment, audience recoil. The case would be cited whenever analysts warned that over-choreographed piety risks spontaneous moral backlash. Political communication researchers built rubrics that felt like seismographs for public trust. They mapped halo inversion the moment admiration drops below neutrality and does not climb back. They noted how the bishop's sentence acted like a grounding wire, channeling outrage into clarity. They compared pre-event image management with post-event repair attempts and concluded that the latter never found a stable footing. In their models, Biblegate ranked as the largest single-night reversal for any Trump family figure on the axis of sincerity. Cultural historians widened the lens and situated the break inside a longer American habit of staging the sacred. They traced earlier eras when leaders posed with pulpit or paraded behind choirs. And they marked the difference between public devotion and public theater. The key, they taught, was not whether prayer appears in public, but whether people are displaced to make room for the shot. Biblegate became the cleanest modern instance of displacement made visible. The crowd pushed back. Then the prop raised high. The chapter's conclusion was spare and devastating. When worship is arranged like marketing, it starts to look like marketing. Meanwhile, the 50-plus generation took the role they have earned over timekeepers of hard memory. In coffee shops and community centers, they told one another where they were when the Watergate hearings aired, how the words tape and gap felt like detonations. Then they described the new feeling clicking live and seeing smoke in high definition, like déjà vu in color. "This is the moment the image broke," one woman said, tapping the newspaper as if to force the lesson into the page. Others nodded because they recognized the tremor that follows a truth you cannot unsee. Letters poured in from retirees who had shelved file boxes and served on juries and prayed in plain rooms without cameras. Watergate taught us that recordings do not lie. One wrote, "But they do expose liars." Another said, "Iran-Contra taught us how secrets move on paper. This taught us how sanctimony moves on stage." The writers did not ask to be thanked, they asked to be heeded. Editors published the letters in a series titled Witness to Witnessing, and the headline felt exactly right. At home, grandparents who had lived through assassinations, recessions, and wars answered new questions with old steadiness. A grandson pointed at the pause frame and asked, "Why did they hold it that way?" The grandfather said, "Because some people think symbols are shortcuts, but faith has no shortcuts." A granddaughter asked, "Will the people forget?" The grandmother said, "People forget shows. They do not forget stings." Then she added, "This one stung." The exchange sounded simple, but it laid down tracks for the next conversation. Documentarians chased those living memories into their films, and the effect deepened the narrative. A montage cut from black and white committee rooms to the lurid glow of modern live streams, from realtor hums to the silent glide of a drone shot. A veteran of newsroom nights said into the camera. Back then, we waited for the morning paper. Now the paper waits for us. The point wasn't speed. It was endurance. Scandal may move faster, the film argued, but the conscience that judges it works at the same human pace. On campuses, the case became an exam you could not cram for and could not game. Professors asked, where is the line between faith and brand, and who has the right to draw it? Students tried out. Students tried out. Brave answers, then revised them after the next documentary screening. Libraries created vertical files where clippings and transcripts sat alongside sermons and community bulletins. The stacks looked like the veins of the story furniture for a memory that needed weight. Biblegate shared shelf space with other breaches, but its spine stood out. Curators mounted gallery exhibits that treated the hearing and the square like adjacent rooms. One wall held broadcast stills. The other held photographs of hands handing out water and milk to strangers. In the center, a quote hovered on clear acrylic. Faith cannot be a political tool. Visitors lingered and left notes that said little and meant much, like, I was there, or I learned, or simply never again. The guest book read like a quiet chorus. The most striking documentaries returned to a single ethical hinge: consent. Did the people in the square consent to be pushed out for a picture? Did the church consent to be framed as a backdrop for power? Did the Bible, a text for reading and living, consent to be lifted as a brand? The films let those questions hang unanswered because the answers were obvious, and because obvious truth can be the most persuasive kind. The audience left with a word that does not trend but lasts: no. Scholarly conferences minted panels around a vocabulary that will outlive the headline. Sacred prop transgression, ritual displacement, performative piety. Papers traced how each concept appeared in the sequence and showed what snapped when they combined. Discussants asked for antidotes and settled on 3 scale down the stage, scale up the service, and tell the truth when it hurts. The room full of people trained to argue agreed more than it expected to. At the end of that year, a thick anthology arrived with a title that sounded like a verdict: The Image That Broke. Inside, historians, ethicists, and media scholars wrote from different angles and landed on the same line. Biblegate represented the largest single public collapse of credibility for a Trump family figure because it damaged the core promise virtue rather than the outer armor power. You can recover from a bad policy with a new policy, the editors wrote, but you cannot easily recover from a bad prayer stage for applause. The conclusion did not gloat. It cautioned. For the 50-plus generation, memory settled into a shape that felt familiar and firm. They filed Biblegate next to the older crises, not because they were identical, but because they taught the same rule. Record everything. Believe the quiet witness. Do not confuse a raised voice with a right claim. Years from now, they said, you will not remember the hashtag, but you will remember the sentence that stripped the show of its shine. In living rooms and small groups, they repeated the sentence like a creed. Morality is not a stage. Cable channels slotted the documentaries into late-night cycles where insomniacs and caretakers watch with a steady focus of people who have lived through enough to know what matters. Streaming platforms built collections labeled Civic Spine, and Biblegate sat near the top tile. Schools borrowed the films for assemblies, pausing to let teenagers write down the bishop's line as if copying a lab procedure. The lesson traveled well because it did not depend on political taste. It ran on the fuel of basic decency. A nation that often forgets found itself rehearsing remembrance. Years faded a little of the heat, but none of the outline. The photo still looked staged. The smoke still hung like a bruise, and the words still cut with the same clean edge. Professors who had been young when Watergate broke now aged into emeritus status, with one last course to teach, and they added this case on the final day. We have taught you to check tapes, once said, and now we teach you to check props. The students laughed, then wrote it down. In the end, Biblegate's place in the record felt earned, not inflated. It did not claim to be the worst wound. It claimed to be the clearest picture of a particular harm. Scholars kept calling it the largest image collapse in that family because the collapse was visible from every seat, the square, the church, the DIS, the living room couch. The 50-plus generation, our long memory, kept saying the comparison words gate Iran-Contra without pretending this was the same. They meant something simpler and deeper. We know what a turning point looks like, and this was one. And so the chapter stayed open on the desk of the nation, ready to be taught again. And when the applause faded, the meaning stepped forward. The final message was simple enough to fit on a scrap of paper, but heavy enough to bend the room. True power is not in a book you hold. It is in a heart that acts for justice. It did not arrive with a drum roll or a spotlight. It arrived the way truth often does. Quiet, steady, undeniable. People leaned in because the sentence did not try to impress them. It tried to guide them. The line cut through the fog of talking points like a lighthouse through rain. Real strength is not the scripture in your palm, the narrator's voice could have said, but the courage in your chest when someone needs protection. The image of that night, smoke, a church facade, a book lifted high, lost its shine beside the living proof of service. Viewers remembered volunteers handing out water, nurses staying late, neighbors walking each other home. Those scenes had no hashtags, no staged angles, no practice smirks. They carried a different kind of light, the kind that lingers. The message did not shame belief. It defended it. A holy text is not a trophy, the words insisted. A holy text is a promise. You keep that promise in courtrooms, classrooms, church basement, and crowded streets. You keep it when no one is filming. You keep it by choosing people over theatrics, duty over display, and mercy over marketing. Jasmine Crockett did not have to recite a poem to seal the moment. She only needed to stand where the evidence stood and let the record speak. When she said, "True power is not in a book you carry, but in a heart that acts for justice," the line sounded less like a victory lap and more like a set of marching orders. It asked nothing fancy, only the difficult daily work. That was why it stayed. The sentence moved through the country the way a clean wind moves through a room. It lifted the curtains of cynicism and let something fresher in. Parents wrote it on notes for their kids. Pastors tucked it into bulletins without a paragraph of explanation. Journalists began using it as a test before writing about any faith moment on a stage. If the act did not serve people, it did not pass. In this light, the photo that once tried to glow now looked cold. It was a picture of borrowed power trying to borrow holiness, and the transaction failed. The frame became a warning label. Do not stage the sacred. The crowd's memory sharpened around that lesson like a muscle learning a new movement. People did not become harsh. They became clear. Clarity, it turned out, was the true climax. The nation did not need louder speeches. It needed cleaner sight. The message gave them that look for the heart, not the prop. Look for the action, not the angle. No one had to be perfect to meet that standard. They only had to be honest and brave when the moment arrived. Jasmine's part in this was not flair, but focus. She took a single image that had been sold as glory and turned it gently but firmly into evidence. Not evidence against faith, but evidence against the misuse of faith. She did it with documents, with restraint, and with a precision that left no room for a counterstory to hide. In doing so, she changed the temperature of the room and then the country. From that night on, her name carried a distinct note. Commentators called her the woman who turned a photo into a permanent indictment, and the phrase fit like a custom-made frame. It was not a threat, it was a record. The indictment was not of religion, but of pretense. It was not of hope, but of hype. It was not of prayer, but of performance. History took the phrase and set it carefully on the shelf where the important tools live. Students repeated it the way trainees repeat safety rules. Do not touch the hot plate. Do not stage the sacred. True power is not in the book you hold. It is in the heart that acts for justice. Each rule prevented a burn. Each rule saved time and pain. Each rule kept the work honest. Jasmine did not become an icon because of volume. She became an icon because of aim. She did not swing wildly. She cut straight. She did not crowd the shot. She cleared it. She did not chase applause. She guarded the record. The steadiness of that posture made people trust the line even more. That trust mattered because the country is often tired. Tired of spins, tired of spats, tired of being told what to feel. The final message did not tell them what to feel. It told them where to look. Look at the fruit. Look at the neighbor. Look at the cost. If a show harms the people it claims to honor, it is not faith. It is false advertising. If a gesture protects the vulnerable, it is not showmanship. It is service. Service, not spectacle, became the last beat of the story. The camera could capture a book held high, but it could not capture a heart choosing to act until that action took shape. It took shape in food on a table, a ride to an appointment, a hand on a shoulder in a hard hallway. It took shape in policies that sheltered the weak, in budgets that matched sermons and leaders who did not need a photographer to keep a vow. Those shapes held. As people repeated the line, it began to change their reflexes. Before a stage event, they asked, "Whom does this help?" Before a press release, they asked, "Where's the service?" Before a rally, they asked, "Who gets pushed aside so this picture can be taken?" The questions were not negative. They were protective. They protected faith from being drained of meaning. They protected citizens from being used as props. They protected justice from being dressed up and sold. In the years that followed, the story of that night shrank to its cleanest outline and stayed there. A picture tried to crown itself truth. A woman lifted the mirror of evidence. The crown slid off. The truth stood on its own. The line remained, "True power is not in the book you hold. It is in the heart that acts for justice." Teachers liked how portable the sentence was. It could ride in a backpack, rest on a dashboard, or sit in a wallet. It could be read out loud before a meeting or whispered before a hard phone call. It sounded right in a sanctuary and right in a courthouse. It did not need music to carry. It did not need a stage to ring. The sentence also carried a quiet dare. If you repeat it, you must try to live it. If you write it, you must try to measure yourself by it. If you hand it to a child, you must be ready to explain it with your own choices. The dare was not cruel. It was kind. It assumed you could rise. It assumed the country could too. Jasmine never pretended. She wrote the rule out of nothing. The line came from the lives of people who had been living it for years without cameras. She only did the work that needed doing at the time it needed to be done. She placed the words where everyone could see them. She held the stage just long enough to drag the stage lights off the prop and onto the promise. Then she stepped back. Stepping back did not shrink her place in the story. It cemented it. Heroes who cling to spotlights become performers. Heroes who release them become landmarks. Jasmine became a landmark, a fixed point on the map of civic conscience. The woman who turned a photo into a permanent indictment was the label. But the function was larger. She taught a reflex and it stuck. That reflex now met every new spectacle at the door. Is there consent? Is there care? Is someone being cleared out so someone else can look holy? The questions arrived like a neighborhood watch for the sacred. If the answers were wrong, the show did not proceed. If the answers were right, no one needed a show. In the end, the drama did not fade. It matured. The action was less about explosions and more about decisions. The thrill came not from a twist, but from a turn away from image and toward integrity. The heartbeat of the story slowed to a strong, sustainable rhythm. It could carry a country without exhausting it. It could carry a life. So the last words of the tale were not shouted. They were placed as you would place a tool back where it belongs. True power is not in the book you hold, the line said, but in the heart that acts for justice. And beneath that, in ink that won't wash out, history wrote a second line. Jasmine Crockett enters the record as the woman who turned a photograph into a lasting indictment. The two sentences sat together like twin rails, one to guide the traveler, one to mark the route already taken. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a